Did you know you can turn a cheap flea market toy into terrain that looks like it was made from an expensive model kit? Well, I just bought this second-hand toy truck at a flea market and turned it into this amazing piece of grimdark wargaming terrain. And today I'll show you how to turn a bland looking toy like this into something amazing. So to start off, I needed to find a base which would be big enough to fit this toy truck. A lot of you might not have access to a big sheet of XPS foam or something similar. So to stay in the spirit of this cheap junk build, I used some smaller pieces of packaging styrofoam. I laid them out to get the right size and the orientation of all the pieces, and then I glued them together using some hot glue and wooden skewers. You can also use some PVA glue for this. I just used some hot glue so I don't have to wait for as long for the glue to dry and I can move on with the build. I also collected a bunch of random junk over the years to add some detail to the base, like this piece of a shower hose, some old food packaging, this random metal emblem, and some more random stuff. The bottom of this food packaging with all the hexagonal tiles looks like it's some sort of fancy tiling or a floor, so I cut that out and glued it onto the base. To make the terrain piece look more interesting, I want the truck to sit on the base at an angle. So I'll cut up the toy truck and remove the wheels on one side. Once I decorate the base more, it will look like the vehicle is partially buried underground. I also removed the loading bucket on the back, but I'll glue that on again later. I do have something specific for it in mind. Now the truck looks a lot better, but the base is still very empty. I started off by gluing some bigger chunks of the styrofoam and bits to the base. I also glued on some smaller chunks all around the base to get some variation in height. These chunks will help create an uneven surface, which helps make it look a lot more realistic in the end. I then went back to the random bits and bobs I showed earlier and started gluing them on. The shower hose could be a nice old broken pipe, for example. And those other bits could just be remnants of other destroyed vehicles or buildings or other stuff, which is partially buried in the ground. The texture of this cardboard is also really nice in my opinion. It could maybe resemble an old piece of beaten metal or something, or just give it an interesting ground texture. So I also glued this onto the base. After that I glued the loading bucket back on. I wanted it to look like it broke off from the truck and slid to the side where it got stuck. To fill it out I used some more styrofoam pieces, and later I'll add some more texture using some sand and pebbles and things like that. No vehicle which gets used this much and is just sitting there for a long time looks completely pristine. So to make it look a lot more worn and damaged, I scratched it up and cut out some random pieces here and there using my hobby knife. I don't think about this too much, I just do what feels right and I try to think about where the damage would be on a vehicle like this. To add texture to the base and blend everything together, I usually make some DIY texture paint. I do this by mixing some wood filler, wood glue and some brown ink. It doesn't have to be wood filler specifically, by the way, most filler should work. This is just what they had for cheap at my local discount store. Same goes for the wood glue. It's just very cheap where I bought it, but you could just use PVA, tacky glue, all fine. The filler is added to provide most of the texture, the wood glue should make it a bit stronger, and the brown ink I added in case any of the texture we apply breaks off or chips off. This tends to happen over time with terrain pieces that get used a lot. And it's fine, it happens, but adding this color to it makes sure that if a chunk does break off, that the color on the inside is not just the color of the filler, which will be white. And now if it does break off, the inside will be brown, just like most of the rest of the base in the end, and it won't stand out as much. I also added some sand and pebbles in certain areas to create even more texture and fill out flatter areas. Then I added some black paint and sand to the remaining texture paint and stippled that on even more things. Adding the black paint makes it easier to differentiate between the two different batches of texture paint. Stipple this everywhere and anywhere. Don't think about it too much. Just make it look dirty and textured. I even added it to the truck itself. This adds some nice, dirty and grimy texture to it. After all, an abandoned truck sitting there like this would probably be dirty and all rusty looking. I also used this texture paint to make it look like the loading bucket is full of debris, and I also added a bunch of sand and pebbles after that. Because we put a lot of texture paint on here, it will take a while to dry, but once it has dried, I used some watered down wood glue to cover all the sand and all the pebbles to make sure they don't fall off. Some of the texture paint will have cracked while drying, or it might look a bit droopy because we put it on really thickly. So to fix this, I mixed up another small batch of texture paint to cover up these areas and go over any of the places I missed before. Once that had dried once again, the only thing left to do is give it all a lick of paint. Priming a model like this is always amazing. It really ties everything together. It really does make it look like more of a coherent piece of terrain instead of just some junk glued to some styrofoam, which, it actually is. To start off, I painted the body of the truck and the bucket using some red paint. You don't need to be very neat with this, we'll add a lot of weathering later on. Don't use a red which is already quite dark, as it will be darkened down later from the weathering as well. So I used quite a bright red color for this. For the base I used a few different brown paints. I wet blended these onto the base to get some nice variation. This way it's not just all one monotone brown color. I also used these brown paints to paint the textured parts on the truck and the bucket, which I want to look like dirt. Again, make sure the browns aren't super dark, as it will get darkened even more later on. After that, I moved on to adding some metallic paints. I stippled and dry brushed this onto the edges and damaged part of the model. And any part I didn't cover with the red paint, I'll try to cover with some of this metallic paint to make it look like the old paint is starting to chip off. To make some of the smaller details stand out, I painted them with a different color, such as the barrel-like details on the side of the truck and these hexagonal shapes on the ground underneath the truck, for example. Things which look black are rarely completely black in real life, such as car tires, for example. They are probably not completely black, they are probably more of a really dark grey, especially if they get used a lot. So, to make the tires of this toy truck look a bit more natural, I painted them using a really dark grey as well, instead of just leaving them as they were. After that's all dry, we can move on to the weathering. My favorite trick to achieve some good looking, easy, cheap and quick weathering is adding streaking grime. Streaking grime is sort of like a green brownish wash, which I applied all over the model. To remove any of the pooling or to tone down the effect a little bit, I removed the excess using some scrunched up toilet paper. Dabbing the toilet paper on also leaves a nice texture, especially on the larger flat areas. Now that the streaking grime has dried, I want to bring back some of the color and texture. So, to start off, I dry brushed the base and any of the dirty texture parts on the truck using a khaki paint. I did the same thing with a metallic paint to bring back some of the shine and the brightness on some of the edges and other parts of the model where I applied metallic paints before. To add some more visual interest and variety, I also used some dirtied down weathering effects. These effects are absolutely amazing. I used a rust and verdigris effect. The effects these give are really nice. If you buy them and use them, do make sure to stir them and shake them really well. I don't know what's in these pots, but it tends to clump up and sink to the bottom, so you really need to get it unstuck and shake it really well. I applied the rust on some of the metal parts, like the wheels, and the verdigris on just some random other parts I wanted to look dirty. And just so you know, these effects can be reactivated using water. So after they dried, I used a matte spray varnish to seal it all in. I think it turned out great in the end. It looks very different from how it started out. However, I do think I could have added some more details to the flat surfaces of the toy truck to make it look more scale appropriate. Hopefully this has inspired you to make something similar like this for yourself. But to make something like this, you might want some more tips on how to make stuff for free or on a budget. So check out this video where I give you some amazing tips and tricks to help you build your own terrain. Thank you for watching.